Hello and welcome to the Japanese Trading Systems. This is a special trading education program where we're going to take a look at some of the trading techniques that the Japanese have developed over the last several hundred years. You know, a lot of people think that trading evolved from the West and from, kind of the Eastern European into the United States mechanisms of finance. But the reality is the Japanese were trading the free market for hundreds of years before the United States market even got going. So we're going to look at some of the techniques and some of the systems that evolved out of that very rich history of trading. Now, before we get going, I want to say this. A lot of people think of candlestick trading when we think about Japanese trading. Candlesticks are a very important and integrated part of the Japanese trading systems, but it's not the focus of this program. If you want to really learn about candlestick trading, Foundations of Stocks and Options is where we really go into the details of trading with Japanese candlesticks. In this program, we're really going to take a look at the overall holistic view of trading and specifically take a look at the Ichimoku clouds. All right, so here's our agenda. In this lesson, we're going to jump right into taking a look at the deep, rich history of the Japanese trading. Then we're going to talk about candlesticks and kind of bridge the gap here between candlesticks and cloud trading. And then before this particular lesson is done, we'll have an introduction into our cloud charts and we'll actually understand how to build our Ichimoku clouds. All right, so let's get going with the history of Japanese trading. As we start taking a look at the rich history of Japanese trading, I think you're going to be really surprised to discover how many techniques we use in the West that were first originated all the way on the other side of the world in this market that we call Japan. The interesting thing is a lot of it happened kind of under a veil. Why? Well, because Japan was evolving politically during this period. It was back in the 1600s, and during that time, Japan was evolving through this really deep political unrest. The shogun was coming into power. The old imperialism that they had at the time was kind of getting all, it was up in turmoil. It was a changing of the guards, if you will. And during that time that is known as the Edo period, a lot of progress, a lot of cultural progress in Japan really set foot and it got established. What's interesting is it was kind of happened under the radar. Japan, during that time period, was kind of cut off from the rest of the world, and it was done that way intentionally because the Japanese people wanted to be completely self-reliant and completely inclusive. And so as you look at my notes here, Japan was cut off from the rest of the world, and their emphasis was on central government. Their philosophy was that the central government can provide for everybody, and so what they did is they focused their drive and their resources on developing a centralized government that would provide for everybody. So everything flowed into the middle and then it flowed out of there. Well, there's always good and bad in those type of situations. One of those circumstances that worked out well for Japan was a very big economic boom. So here's what happened. All of the land was assessed and it was taxed based on their yield of rice crops. I forget the exact statistic, but I think during this period, rice production went up by like 40 or 50%. It was just a huge increase in production. And one of the reasons is because the land was so valued for the production of rice. And so all the land was assessed, it was taxed based on the yield of rice. Now, whenever you think about percentages of taxes, we get frustrated here in America for some of our income taxes. Well, right here in Japan, look at this, peasants paid 40% of their rice in tax directly to the central government, and the central government would then redistribute that 40% of their labor. So just imagine, you're out here working your tail off, trying to harvest all this rice, and as soon as you harvest it, 40%, that's 4 out of every 10 grains of rice that you harvest, they get shipped off immediately to the government. That's what the Japanese people were facing at the time. But what was interesting is the finance, the commerce, and the trade started to grow exponentially because of the pooling of the resources. And not to get off into a political commentary, but it's periods like this that really create a lot of confusion whenever we do think about politics because, in America, we're very free market, we're very much about capitalism, but other parts of the world, the idea of centralized government has really taken foothold. And so which one is better? Well, I'm a free market capitalist, so I tend to agree with that philosophy. But there are certain times when there are benefits maybe of some central government planning and central government working. And this is certainly a circumstance where it did flourish at least for a season. Now what we also see is after those seasons flourish, they do tend to implode. So that's the other side of that because people aren't rewarded for their labor. But that's the other side of it. Point is here that at the beginning, when the central government really took over, it really created a great economic environment where things could boom and things could flourish. And that's exactly what happened in Japan. At the same time, time, rice became the primary currency of choice. Now, this is a little bit weird for Americans to think about rice being a currency of choice. But in Japan, it was the thing that they had in the most supply. It was essential for life because it was, it was the life-giving food here. And so it was used as a commodity to trade, and then it ultimately turned into a currency, which we're going to see here. Now, where that currency led, where that rice led, is it led to one of the first central exchanges. If you read any really good history of free market trading, any history of banking and whatnot, you're going to read about the Dojima Rice Exchange. The Dojima Rice Exchange is a central exchange where the Japanese people could come and they could exchange their rice in exchange for either a piece of paper that said this is good for X number of bushels of rice, or they could exchange it for other rice or other things. So it just became a central exchange where things took place there. So the rice trade led to the creation of this Dojima Rice Exchange, which is seen as a forerunner of modern banking. Now, how so? Well, in modern banking, what do? We take all of our money, we deposit it at the bank, and then the bank gives us an IOU. They say, you've got X number of dollars on reserve here at the bank. That's exactly what the Dojima Rice Exchange started to set up in Japan. People would come, they would deposit their rice into this rice bank, if you will, and they would get a piece of paper in exchange for that. Now, this all started around 1697. By 1697, it was established, and it played a major role, not just in Japanese banking system and the monetary system there, but ultimately it led to part of the international monetary system as well. And here's the other interesting thing. The Dojima Rice Exchange was the first early concept of futures trading. So here in America, we take futures trading for granted, and a lot of people think that futures trading came from America, but in reality, the Dojima Rice Exchange was one of the first centralized exchanges of futures trading. And of course, the thing they were trading was rice. All right, so let's take a look here. When we think about getting paid in rice, that sounds a little bit weird, right? Well, look at these pieces of paper that I've got on the screen here. These are just some images I've pulled out. And what happened at the time is the culture used this rice as the primary trading tool as a form of currency. So I put here in place of currency, but it was the currency. And so they would just simply trade rice. Well, I'm sure you can imagine if you ever had a bag of rice that just exploded and rice grains went everywhere. Well, it's not that convenient to just be carrying bushels of rice around. So what did people do? They took their bushels of rice and they deposited them into the rice bank. We'll just call it a rice bank for simplicity here. And then in exchange for that, what did they get? They got this piece of paper right here, a depository note, something that said you have deposited X bushels of rice and now you can go trade this piece of paper. And so rather than carrying bushels of rice all around the countryside, what they did is they would bring the rice in, they would deposit it into the bank, and then they would get these pieces of paper, just like the ones you see here on the screen. These are actual notes right here. And these notes, what could happen is they could be traded just like money. Now take a look here. This is a transcription. Of course, I don't speak Japanese, so I can't fully transcribe this, but this is something that I took from the internet. This is called a hansatsu. According to my Japanese friends, I am pronouncing that relatively close to accurately. So it's a hansatsu is the way we pronounce this. That's this piece of paper. Now, if you look at this piece of paper, that is side 1, this is side 2 over here. So just imagine that it's a front and back. It's just been laid out so you can see it here. And this particular one here is a hansatsu of silver, 1 monmi of rice. It's a trade note issued by, and I'm not even going to pretend to pronounce that one right there, in this location, Yamato. And then here it goes on. It's issued in whatever that word is, the first year. And this one happened in 1865. So this has got a date of 1865 and all that Japanese writing there. This is an early type. Now read through here. This scarce rice note is about 6 inches in length. So you can imagine it's about, yay tall maybe, about 6 inches in length. It's an 1.5 inches wide. And it's made of thick, high-quality paper. So it's just like our currency. It's just the thing behind it that's backing it is a little bit different here. Both sides are printed in black ink, and each side is overprinted with 2 red validation stamps. Now, I've done some history or some research on this, and what they would do is there was actually a whole art to designing these notes, and people would, their entire career was nothing but drawing on these note cards here and writing out what they were worth. But those red stamps that you see on here, that is the validation that says that this piece of paper is actual currency. It's actually validated. So it's like a stamp of approval here. Now, one of these red stamps shows a large bale of rice. If you can see it on here. I'm not sure if you can see it on your computers, but right here there's a bale of rice, and you can see the rope that is binding it here. And on the top of one side is a reclining water buffalo. So I'm guessing that this is the water buffalo up here. I'm not that familiar with water buffaloes, but I'm guessing that's what it is. And the rest of the note is covered with Japanese characters from top to bottom. The denomination here is 1 monmi, which was the equivalent of 3.75 grams of silver. Now, we're getting to something of solid substance. If you've heard me teach on the underlying value of currency, you might have heard me say that 1 ounce of silver is always worth an ounce of silver. Well, eventually you got to get back to a standard here, and that's what you see. So all the stuff that you see described here, ultimately transcribed to 1 monmi, which was the equivalent of 3.75 grams of silver. But it wasn't backed by silver, it was backed by rice. And that's the interesting thing about it. So now we've got a piece of paper that has value, and on the other side of that is what? It's a bushel of rice. And that bushel of rice is worth something. And so you start to see where this value and this whole monetary system started to evolve from. It's really quite interesting there. Well, as we start to think about these pieces of paper being backed by rice, let's think about the way things work here in the United States. In the United States, it's the U.S. dollars that were backed by gold. If you go back to the original U.S. dollars, now it's not so today, but in the beginning, U.S. dollars were backed by gold. In fact, it was up until the 1970s that the U.S. dollars were backed by gold, which is one of the reasons the U.S. dollar became the world reserve currency. So now that we've removed that backing, maybe it won't be the reserve currency forever, but we'll go to that discussion at a different time. So here's what you see here. The U.S. dollars were backed by gold, but in 1700 Japan, that paper currency that you saw, the hansatsu, was backed by rice. Now, here's the interesting distinction. Unlike gold, production of rice can go up and down. One season it may have a particularly good harvest, one season it may not have a great harvest. And what do you see happening when you have a constant fluctuation of supply and demand? Well, you start to see that the cost goes up and down with that fluctuation of supply and demand. And consequently, what happens to the pieces of paper? Well, they're going to be worth more or less. And now, if you're tracking with me here, you see the completion of how this futures contract, essentially a contract here, gets established. It leads to a shift in the value of the piece of paper, and that value shift up and down based on production of the rice will go up or down. And of course, that's something we can trade. So let's kind of wrap this up here. Once you've got all of that flowing here, once you understand you got a piece of paper that's backed by rice, not backed by gold, not backed by a solid commodity, but instead backed by rice, as the crop yields fluctuate, the value of the hansatsu is going to fluctuate as well. And of course, that price fluctuation, what is it? It's an opportunity to make money. That is exactly why the Japanese rice trading exchange was created. That's why it was so huge. It's why it was important. And it's how it ended up changing the world and how trading ended up kind of evolving out of that whole corner of the globe. A corner that most people don't even think about. So there's a little bit of an interesting history of Japanese rice trading, and as we go from here, I'm going to show you how that price fluctuation got marked out and how that led to candlesticks and ultimately to these things that we call the Ichimoku clouds.